Okay, next up we have Dr. Chris Masterjohn. So Chris Masterjohn is currently Assistant Professor of Health and Nutrition Sciences at Brooklyn College, which is part of the City University of New York. He has a PhD in nutritional sciences with a concentration in biochemical and molecular nutrition from the University of Connecticut. He's written hundreds of articles for his blog, The Daily Lipid, as well as Mother Nature Obeyed. For many years, Chris has been representing the nutritional edicts of the Weston A. Price Foundation and the health benefits that come from consuming traditional foods. He is one of the world's foremost experts on the subject of cholesterol and serum lipids, and today he's going to be talking to us about vitamin D. So please join me in welcoming Professor Chris Masterjohn.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. Before I start out, I want to make it very clear for those of you who are here in the morning for Rob Wolf's talk that he was just being modest, and in fact, Rob Wolf is a much better salsa dancer than I am. And the only reason that he carries my gym bag is because we made a deal that I would carry his salsa shoes. All right, so today I'm going to talk about the evolution of diverse vitamin D requirements. In other words, why those of us with different patterns of ancestry may require different amounts of vitamin D or different amounts of circulating 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which is the marker for vitamin D status that we all get measured in the doctor's office, and why we therefore need a more nuanced way of interpreting vitamin D status than simply using a cutoff for 25-OHD and saying, well, people below this cutoff all need to be taking vitamin D supplements. The subtitle of my talk is using race, ethnicity, genetics, and additional blood markers to better interpret 25-OHD. And using the generally standard definitions, race refers to physical characteristics, and ethnicity refers to cultural traditions, including food and language and so on and so forth. And I think genetics would fall more into the category of race there, but we'll also see how someone's genetics interacts with the cultural dietary patterns that they've inherited. So I think both of those words are, in a way, appropriate. However, I would also note that many scientists in anthropology object to the idea of race, and I think the reasons for making those objections are valid. And so I think by the time we get to the end of my talk, I think it would be we'll come to the conclusion that it would be a more legitimate thing to say that our pattern of ancestry is what's really affecting our vitamin D requirement, because our pattern of ancestry includes the genetics that we inherit from our distant ancestors and our recent ancestors. It includes some epigenetic changes and dietary and cultural traditions that we inherit from our ancestors. So I think that will be the most appropriate term to use. But also what we'll ultimately see is that although genetics are driving a lot of the changes I'm going to be talking, or a lot of the difference in requirements that I'm going to be talking about, our knowledge of genetics right now is not sufficient on its own, and probably never will be sufficient on its own to use genetics alone as a way to decide how much vitamin D someone needs. And so we'll always have to be looking at these additional blood markers that I'm going to talk about to help better understand what's going on in the body and to help create a more sophisticated way of understanding whether someone really needs more vitamin D or not. All right, so the data on this screen is from one particular study of 105 black and white adolescent American girls. But the general result that's shown here is consistent with many studies, and it's widely accepted that whites have higher vitamin D status than blacks on average, using 25-OHD as a marker of vitamin D status. If you know what this is, you should, well, for now it's sufficient to note that this is the marker of vitamin D status that your doctor measures when you get it measured. In a few more slides, I'll talk in a little bit more detail about what that marker is. But what you can see here is clearly not only do the black girls have about 1/3 lower vitamin D status than the white girls have, but usually the laboratory reference ranges are about 30, maybe 32 nanograms per milliliter. And so you could also say that if you imagine a line cutting across here, that on average the black girls have inadequate vitamin D status, and on average the white girls have adequate vitamin D status. The conventional explanation for this is an evolutionary explanation, and that idea, which has been put forth several times over the course of the 20th century, and is generally the most commonly cited hypothesis relating to vitamin D and evolution, is the idea that white skin evolved as a means of obtaining adequate vitamin D from sunlight once humans migrated out of equatorial Africa, and therefore black Americans have skin color adapted to equatorial regions but are living in regions distant from the equator, and they're thus displaced from their region of ancestry and are intrinsically predisposed to vitamin D deficiency. Later, I'll come to talk a little bit about the Inuit, and we could say among the Inuit living in the Arctic that we also observe they have very low vitamin D status. And there's a similar explanation there, only instead of saying that they're displaced from the environment that they're adapted to, we say the conventional view is that they're just inhabiting an environment that no one could be optimally adapted to. And there are problems, in my view, with both of these explanations. So first I'll note that there is some support for this. So among the main pieces of support for this is that the physiology that melanin in the skin, which is responsible for skin color, does absorb UVB waves, ultraviolet B waves that are responsible for vitamin D synthesis. And therefore, it takes someone with darker skin a longer amount of time to achieve maximal vitamin D synthesis than it takes someone with lighter skin. That's well established and uncontroversial. There are also some small studies showing that when people migrate from regions closer to the equator to regions further away from the equator, their vitamin D status declines, although those studies are small and generally can't account for changes in lifestyle and changes in diet and so on and so forth. I will point out here that no one has ever established that the amount of vitamin D that we need is equivalent to maximal vitamin D synthesis. And in fact, if you look, for example, at Israeli lifeguards, where they have more than ample opportunity for maximal vitamin D status, they also have 20 times the risk of kidney stones as the general population. And that would suggest that maximal vitamin D status isn't necessarily our goal. And so we could question the relevancy. It's uncontroversial that people with darker skin require more time to achieve maximal vitamin D status, but it's not clear that any of us should have maximal vitamin D status as our actual goal. But there are a few problems with this explanation that I'm going to get into now. So the first problem is that all the genetic analyses that have come out over the last decade or so, and increasingly over the last few years, suggest that light skin evolved independently in Europeans and in East Asians, and that the selection that favored light skin began about 10 to 20,000 years ago. By contrast, it's generally thought that modern humans most likely migrated out of Africa about 120,000 years ago. There are some people who make arguments for 50,000 years ago, and there are some people who make arguments that 1.8 million years ago, archaic humans migrated out of Africa, and the evolution to modern humans was multi-regional in nature. But the general consensus is in favor of over 100,000 years ago, our common ancestors migrated out of Africa. No matter what way you look at it, that leaves an incredible time gap between when humans first migrated out of Africa and when light skin began evolving. And that isn't necessarily a fatal flaw in the hypothesis that the migration out of Africa drove light skin evolution to obtain adequate vitamin D, but it isn't necessarily clearly consistent with that either, and I would say it's a reason to question it, because why didn't this selection for light skin begin 50,000 or 100,000 years ago if that was the factor that was driving the evolution of light skin? The second problem is that although at our latitude whites have higher vitamin D status than non-whites, that's true everywhere in the world when you look at the aggregate. And as I explained to you this slide, I think it will become very clear that the driving difference between black and white 25-OHD levels in America cannot be the movement of non-whites away from the equator. So what this is a meta-analysis of 394 studies, including over 33,000 people, and plotted on the horizontal axis is basically distance from the equator. So this is the equator here, and the further we go to the right, the further the people are away from the equator. On the vertical axis is 25-OHD in nanomoles per liter. Most of us think in terms of nanograms per milliliter, so I made that conversion here, where this is equal to 20, 40, and 60 nanograms per milliliter. It's probably hard for you to see the difference between the open circles and the closed circles. The open circles represent Caucasians, the closed circles represent non-Caucasians. If you can see the difference, great, but if you can't see the difference, I think it's easier to look at the dotted line representing the general trend for Caucasians and the solid black line representing the general trend for non-Caucasians. And you can see the density of the dots represents the density of where that data was taken. So we have a lot of data taken between these latitudes. We have less as you go towards the equator, and we have hardly any in the Arctic Circle. And there's two trends, I think, that are important to note here. So first is, it's only for Caucasians that vitamin D status declines with increasing distance away from the equator. That trend does not exist for non-Caucasians. The other point to note is that at their ancestral latitudes, if we assume, for example, that the equator, we could assume that equatorial regions represent the ancestral latitudes for humans in general. Whether we're here or whether we're in temperate latitudes or even heading up towards the Arctic, it's always the case that the mean for Caucasians is higher than the mean for non-Caucasians. If any trend is apparent from this, it's not that everyone's 25-OHD status declines as they get away from the equator, and it's not that non-whites' 25-OHD status is a lot lower away from the equator than towards the equator. It's that Caucasians stand out as having, from a global perspective, a uniquely high 25-OHD status compared to everyone else in the world. And so if anything is the case, you would seem to look at this and say, maybe Caucasians have a specific adaptation to higher 25-OHD status. And if that's the fact, you might ask the question that if we're doing research studies on what's the optimal 25-OHD status in which Caucasians are overrepresented, then maybe we should be really careful before we apply Caucasian 25-OHD status to everyone else in the world. There's another potential problem here, and this isn't as critical a problem because clearly there are many things that affect bone mineral content. But in this same exact study that I showed you in the beginning where white girls had higher 25-OHD than black girls, the black girls had higher bone mineral density than the white girls. And again, to be clear, there are a lot of things that can affect bone mineral density. But what 25-OHD status is set as optimal is set on the basis of benefiting our bone mineral density. And so something about this seems problematic if we're going to say that on average the black girls are deficient and on average the white girls are sufficient, when in fact the black girls' bone mineral density is better off. All right, so what could be an alternative way to explain this? In order to really answer that question, I need to go back and review the physiology of vitamin D and make sure we're all on the same page. What I'm going to show you here is a very simplified version of what the function of the most well-established function of vitamin D is in the body. And if you've studied this physiology in greater detail, you'll know that I'm leaving some things out, like the interaction between calcium and phosphorus and several of the auxiliary hormones that augment this system. But this is sufficient to support the conclusions of my talk here. So the main function of vitamin D is to be metabolized into a hormone known as 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D, or calcitriol, which regulates serum calcium, specifically by increasing serum calcium at the expense of bone calcium, at the expense of fecal calcium, and at the expense of urinary calcium. In other words, when we have more circulating calcitriol, that helps take calcium out of our bones into our blood. It helps prevent us from excreting calcium in the kidney, and it helps increase our intestinal calcium absorption. The main way our body decides how much calcitriol to make is through the parathyroid hormone made by the parathyroid glands. So our parathyroid glands are constantly monitoring our serum calcium, and their goal is to keep it in a very well-defined range. Because if serum calcium drops, that means that our nerves and our muscles can become deficient in calcium, and calcium is a critical regulator of nerve impulses and muscular contraction. And so if serum calcium drops, we become vulnerable to tetany, which in its least severe manifestation could be cognitive disturbance, but in its most severe manifestation could be tremors, seizures, coma, and death. So in response to low serum calcium, the parathyroid glands make parathyroid hormone, and that acts on the kidney to increase. I should have explained this first. When we're exposed to vitamin D from the sun or the diet, it's coming in through the liver, and it's turned into 25-hydroxyvitamin D, or calcidiol. Then it's made in the kidney to the active hormone calcitriol. So what parathyroid hormone is doing is acting on the kidney to increase the conversion of calcidiol to calcitriol. Parathyroid hormone is also suppressing urinary calcium excretion. And it's also assisting calcitriol in acting on the bone to increase bone resorption and release calcium into the serum. All right, so the reason that we use calcidiol, or 25-OHD, as a marker of vitamin D status is because when we're exposed to vitamin D from sunlight or through food or through taking supplements, it's very quickly metabolized by the liver into 25-OHD. And that means that circulating amounts of vitamin D are useless as a marker of vitamin D nutritional status because they only reflect what we were recently exposed to. On the other hand, the production of calcitriol is highly regulated for the purposes of maintaining serum calcium. So our calcitriol level doesn't reflect nutritional status, it reflects what those needs are to maintain serum calcium. That leaves calcidiol, because it's relatively loosely regulated. The more vitamin D we're exposed to, the more the calcidiol level in our blood increases. All right, that leaves one question to remain, and that is, if calcitriol remains normal when calcidiol is low enough to indicate vitamin D deficiency, then how is vitamin D actually improving our bone mineral density? Well, the reason is there are two ways to get sufficient calcitriol. One is to get more vitamin D from the diet or from sunshine or supplements. That increases 25-OHD and increases calcitriol. And by doing that, we have increased calcitriol by increasing the supply of calcitriol. The alternative is for the parathyroid glands to sense low serum calcium and become the signal for greater demand for calcitriol. And despite not having an excess of vitamin D coming in here, the parathyroid glands say, hey, kidney, you really need to make more of this active hormone. So the problem of having this method of achieving adequate calcitriol is that the elevated parathyroid hormone is acting to take calcium out of our bones. So the reason that getting vitamin D in the diet or sunshine and improving our 25-OHD status is good for us is because by improving the supply of 25-OHD to make our calcitriol, then we don't need the parathyroid hormone system as a signal of demand, and we cut out the parathyroid hormone's role in increasing bone resorption. So the cutoff point for adequate 25-OHD is set for what is the level of 25-OHD that will maximally suppress our parathyroid hormone and thereby remove the burden on the bones of releasing the calcium into the blood. Okay, so the logic for adequate 25-OHD is what leads to the lowest parathyroid hormone levels and therefore maximizes the health of our bones by making it so that we don't depend as much on our bones to supply calcium into the blood. All right, there's a few caveats that are important to note here. One is that this isn't just a matter of vitamin D, it's a matter of vitamin D and calcium. If we have a dietary deficiency of calcium, that's going to come in here. And regardless of vitamin D, we're going to have lower serum calcium and stimulate the parathyroid glands to make more of the active hormone. And so if we don't have adequate calcium intakes, that's going to actually sap our supply of 25-OHD because we need to make more calcitriol. As an example of how that can play out, this is data from a study in rats where they were given the same adequate amount of vitamin D, but they were either put on a diet that was normal calcium or deficient calcium. And the rats that had normal calcium, the rats that had deficient calcium had a massive increase in calcitriol production, as shown on the right. And this came with a massive slashing of their 25-OHD levels, almost to a third of the original levels. So if we go back to this system, 25-OHD isn't a specific marker of vitamin D status, but rather, if you keep everything else the same, better vitamin D status means better calcidiol levels. But if you have other factors, such as calcium deficiency, that are causing you to utilize vitamin D at a higher rate, then those can also lower the vitamin D status. Furthermore, as we'll see momentarily, some people may have genetics that favor a greater rate of calcitriol production as a means of achieving higher biological vitamin D activity without the need for parathyroid hormone. And that's where we come back into the question of why do non-whites have different 25-OHD levels than whites. This is a study where African Americans and white Americans were compared based on their genetics in the pathways that regulate vitamin D metabolism. And there were a number of genetic variations that were noted that are listed here, but there's only one that I'm going to focus on. And that's the activity of the 1-hydroxylase, which is the enzyme that catalyzes the conversion of 25-OHD to calcitriol, or 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. And there's two sets of data here. The one on the right shows the proportion of different genetics for this enzyme in African Americans in the left panel and white Americans in the right panel. And one thing that and the one on the left shows how these genetic polymorphisms affected their vitamin D status. So if you look on the left, you can see that African Americans who have the referent allele have much lower 25-hydroxyvitamin D levels than white Americans. But if you look at African Americans who have the variant allele, which is shown in red, they have identical 25-OHD levels as white Americans. That suggests that differences in the genetics of the enzyme that converts calcidiol to calcitriol can fully account for the difference between African Americans and white Americans. So this is particularly remarkable because this enzyme has absolutely nothing to do with skin color at all. And if you look at the proportions of these alleles, we said the red one is the one where African Americans have the same as white Americans. You can see that the red one is just a sliver here, and it's present in much higher numbers in white Americans. But if you look at the orange part, that indicates people that have one of each, people who are heterozygous for the two different alleles. And you can see that a lot more African Americans are represented in orange, but for white Americans, red and orange, meaning having at least one of the variant allele, is half of white Americans, and it's only about a quarter of African Americans. So what we could say is, if this genetic difference is what accounts for the difference in blood levels of 25-OHD, then it actually has nothing to do with skin color, and it has nothing to do with the amount of melanin in the skin blocking UVB light. It instead has to do with the downstream metabolism of vitamin D. Now that's particularly interesting because calcitriol is the active hormone, and if, for example, African Americans are converting calcidiol to calcitriol at a higher rate, then it may be the case that they have genetics that favor higher biological vitamin D activity with lower 25-OHD levels, whereas white Americans favor higher 25-OHD levels without higher biological vitamin D activity. One interesting point is that these genetics don't have any effect on the 25-OHD levels of white Americans. So it's either interacting with other genetics or it's interacting with dietary patterns. And one possibility would be that this allele is related to how well you can support production of the active hormone in the face of a relative lack of dietary calcium. So to make that point, shown here is the calcium intake of Americans broken down by race and ethnicity on the left and osteoporosis risk in the columns. If you just compare white total to black total here, you can see that in general, in general, if you compare the top number here to the top number here, you can see that in general, white Americans have twice the calcium intake as black Americans do, and that could be a potential interaction with the genetics shown here. So if we go back to the original study that I showed you, with the 105 black and white girls, we see in fact that the black girls have 26% higher concentrations of calcitriol, the active hormone, and they don't have a difference in parathyroid hormone concentration. So that could suggest that the black girls are better making the active hormone without the need for parathyroid hormone, and thereby making greater biological activity of vitamin D in their blood without causing the cost to their bones, and that's why they have higher bone mineral density. And as a way of calculating that, I just took the ratio of means between these two graphs, and you can see that the black girls have a higher calcitriol to PTH ratio, suggesting that for the PTH they're spending, they're getting more of the active hormone form of vitamin D. There are a few other examples where this could be the case. Shown here are Greenland Inuit and Danes on traditional or Western diets. And you can see here that if you compare Inuits consuming a Western diet to Danes consuming a Western diet, the Danes have higher 25-OHD levels. But if you just look at these first two bars in each graph, you can see that when you're looking at calcitriol levels, the Inuit have higher calcitriol levels than the Danes do on the Western diet. And if you look on the right, they have lower PTH levels than the Danes do on the Western diet. In the red bars is what happens when you put the Inuit on their traditional diet. 25-OHD goes up to rival that of the Danes, calcitriol goes even higher, and PTH goes even lower. So this is another case where it seems that people of non-white ancestry have adaptations to having better biological vitamin D status without the cost to their bones, despite lower 25-OHD levels. And this is another reason to raise that question: should we be applying what we've decided are the optimal 25-OHD levels to these other groups who are not well represented in the data that we've been collecting? Here's an example of white, Asian, and multiracial students and skateboarders in Hawaii who had an average sun exposure. This is adjusted to sun exposure with 0 sunscreen. They had an average unprotected sun exposure. Excuse me, this is also adjusted to total body. So if they had half their body exposed, they cut the number in half. Their sun exposure was equivalent to spending over 22 hours per week total body with no sunscreen on. And the title of this paper is Low Vitamin D Status Despite Abundant Sun Exposure. But who says this is low? If the logic is that people with darker skin take longer to maximize their vitamin D status, well, for God's sakes, this amount of sun exposure should be enough, right? And here you see that Asians have, does this number sound familiar? 33% lower 25-OHD than whites, and the multiracial students and skateboarders have intermediate values. And by everyone's standards, again, the mean is below what we say is the cutoff for adequacy. So again, if we go back to that original slide where we show the global data, all these specific instances are consistent with the idea that whites seem to be the oddball when you look at the global prevalence, and we're also the ones who are doing the most studies on ourselves to determine what the optimal 25-OHD levels are. Okay, there's something that sort of stands in contrast to the data that I've shown you. This is a recent investigation into the 25-OHD levels of the Maasai, who are dark-skinned cattle herders in equatorial Africa, and the Hadza, who keep popping up in everyone's presentation today, who have dark skin and are hunter-gatherers in a similar region. And you can see that their 25-OHD levels are higher than what's typical of whites, and certainly what's typical of non-whites. The methodology that was used to generate these figures is different than used in most of the other studies, and if you adjust for the difference in methodology, these figures would drop to 37 for the Maasai and 33 for the Hadza. But that's still an outlier in terms of being much higher than what we see in non-whites generally in these other studies. There are a few things to note here. It could be a lifestyle difference, although these groups are not getting maximal sun exposure. They are wearing a moderate amount of clothes and seeking shelter from the noonday sun, so they're getting moderate sun exposure compared to what's available to them. But it's also important to note that in Africa is the greatest genetic diversity in the world. And so you can't assume that because someone has ancestry that traces to Africa, or because their skin is dark, that they all have the same genetics. And in fact, in general, the groups that led to the migrations through the Atlantic slave trade were taken from regions in Africa where this is a little beyond my expertise, but if my reading is correct, where the diets were traditionally agricultural and would have been relatively low in calcium compared to these groups. And if you look at the Maasai and Hadza, the Maasai make milk as their primary product, so they have very high calcium intakes. And the Hadza, although they don't consume dairy products, they consume, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, they consume a plant called baobab that is extremely high in calcium, higher than calcium on a per weight basis than milk is. And some researchers have said it's one of their 5 food groups, and it accounts for about 14% of their calories. So I think both the Maasai and the Hadza consume very large amounts of calcium. And so maybe that calcium intake spares their vitamin D, and that's what's raising their 25-OHD levels. But I also think it's possible that what we see here is that people who are adapted to high calcium intakes may have genetic adaptations that are less geared towards protecting their bones because their calcium levels are so abundant that it's not as much of a concern. Whereas groups that have ancestry with low calcium intakes may be prioritizing, saying, hey, wait a second, we really don't want to be as reliant on PTH as a way to make calcitriol, because PTH is going to dig calcium out of our bones. And if we don't have consistent incoming calcium, that could leave us with low bone mineral density. So this could reflect that the Maasai and Hadza, and to my knowledge no one has investigated their genetics, but it could reflect that their genetics reflect an ancestral high calcium intake. And Europeans who have a cultural history of dairy producing also have genetics that reflect an ancestral high calcium intake, whereas some other groups that don't reflect that history may have genetics related to vitamin D metabolism that are much more protective of their bones. And that may be what's playing out in the differences in 25-OHD between these groups. All right, so what can we practically conclude from this? Well, all of my practical conclusions are very tentative. I want to make that clear. But I would say that, in my opinion, people with non-white ancestry may be adopted to a lower optimal 25-OHD than people with white ancestry. I think we can be more confident that that's true for the Inuit and the African Americans because it's been better characterized in those groups, and less confident that it's true for Asians, but I think it's probably true for Asians. However, I also want to stress that, as we saw with the genetic polymorphisms, when you're looking at these groups that we typically classify ourselves into, it's all about probability, because the genetics have nothing to do with skin color and nothing to do with whether people identify with those particular groups. So even within those groups, there's going to be people with different genetics, and you have to treat each individual as an individual. So I think in the absence of more nuanced guidelines, which we can't develop yet because we don't have the knowledge, using calcitriol and PTH can assist in interpreting low 25-OHD. And I think caution is warranted before beginning high-dose vitamin D supplementation in response to low 25-OHD without taking these considerations into account. And I want to stress that the next two slides, which are my concluding slides, are even more tentative than these general principles. Okay. I told you a lie before, which is a lie that everyone else tells everyone else, which is that calcitriol is the active hormone form of vitamin D. In fact, calcitriol is just 1,000 times more active than 25-OHD is. And you can say, well, Chris, isn't 1,000 times a lot? Well, it is until you consider the fact that 25-OHD circulates at 1,000 times the concentration that calcitriol does. So in fact, I think circulating 25-OHD and circulating calcitriol probably both represent meaningful contributions to circulating biological vitamin D activity. And this is not ready for diagnosis, but I think if you were to add 1,000 times the calcitriol levels to the 25-OHD levels, that would be a potentially meaningful index of circulating biological vitamin D activity. Well, that's easier than it sounds, because the units reported on the lab result for 25-OHD are nanograms per milliliter, and the units reported for calcitriol are picograms per milliliter, and that's 1,000-fold difference. So actually, you can just add those two numbers together. And I find this really remarkable. If you go back to the data I showed you at the beginning and you actually create that index for the black and white girls, the black girls come to 71 and the white girls come to 69, which is nearly identical. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that at the intracellular level, the vitamin D activity is the same. And so I very much caution against using this for more than gathering insights and satisfying potential curiosity. However, I do think that if research studies were using an index like this or trying to refine this index, and I do think if forward-thinking clinicians who treat large numbers of patients were to collect calcitriol data and examine how this comes out, I think in the future that would provide useful insights that could be very valuable. However, elevations in calcitriol do suggest that low 25-OHD is due to increased utilization rather than decreased input, meaning decreased input from sunshine and food. But it doesn't clarify whether the reason you have greater conversion is because your body senses the demand to do so, or whether you're boosting the supply, for example, because of your genetics. And that's where I think parathyroid hormone comes in. What I'm about to tell you with parathyroid hormone is still tentative, but I think it's more practically useful at the current time. The PTH reference range is 10 to 65, and that's not set at what's optimal for what's optimal. It's set at what rules out parathyroid-related disorders, as far as I understand it. And I think that you could use a narrower range to help better interpret 25-OHD. So let's look at a couple examples. If you look at the Danes on the Western diet, they had a PTH of 37. If you look at the Inuit on the Western diet, they had a PTH of 30. And on the traditional diet, that dropped to 22. In a very speculative back-of-the-envelope calculation, we could say that if the Inuit going on their traditional diet made that drop by 8, then maybe if the Danes were to optimize their diet, that would drop to around 30 or 29. Okay, take a step forward. A recent meta-analysis of dozens of studies, and dozens of studies with very conflicting results, of the ability of vitamin D and calcium to suppress PTH, determined that one of the key determinants of how effective vitamin D and calcium are at suppressing PTH is the baseline PTH level. So if you take people with a PTH over 49, vitamin D and calcium tended to cause a 21-point drop in that. If you take people with a baseline of 38 to 49, it tended to drop 17. And if you take people with a baseline of lower than 38, it tended to drop about 2. So the huge difference in vitamin D and calcium suppression of PTH is somewhere somewhere in this over 30 mark. And if you took the middle of this range and you cut it by 17, you'd come to a number that was pretty close to 30. So I would say that as a tentative best guess, I think that the point at which vitamin D and calcium optimization can suppress PTH maximally is probably by bringing it down to somewhere around 30. So I think if you see someone with a relatively low 25-OHD and you're not sure whether you should consider that low, if you look at their PTH and it's above 30, I think that gives you a clue that, yeah, that's probably the body sensing that this 25-OHD is inadequate, and the greater it departs from 30, the greater you can be confident of that. And I would leave you with one final thought. How often, just shout out a number, how often does the average person get their 25-OHD checked?
Once a year.
Once a year? Okay. The parathyroid gland responds to your changes in your serum calcium level within fractions of a second. So you could say that your PTH gland is monitoring your vitamin D calcium economy several million times per day. And if the PTH gland is putting out PTH into your blood based on its judgment of how deficient you have been or adequate you've been over several million samples over the course of each day, then I think if we're able to take these blood measurements once a year, we should once a year consult the parathyroid gland's opinion about whether this person has a low 25-OHD. Because I think that the parathyroid gland has a lot of knowledge about what happened in the interim that we wouldn't necessarily have. And we can get an insight into, we can't talk to the parathyroid gland, but we can take the measurement, and I think that should prove valuable. And remember, this isn't too far out of left field, because the rationale for why we set optimal 25-OHD levels at where they are is maximal suppression of parathyroid hormone. All I'm doing is taking that rationale and saying, hey, it might not be maximally suppressed at the same 25-OHD in everyone, so let's actually look at whether it's maximally suppressed in those people. And that's a way of taking the conventional rationale and better individualizing it to the particular people that we're treating, or to ourselves if we're asking for the measurement. All right, with that, I thank you for your attention, and I open the floor to any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Master-John, for a really fascinating presentation. So while people line up for questions, I just want to again ask people to tweet their questions for the panel discussion, which is coming after this. And we're going to have a short break before the panel, starting at 4. So go ahead and line up at the 2 microphones. Thanks.
I guess we'll alternate. No?
Hi, my name is Cindy Cronick, and I'm studying Ayurveda, and I just found out about this symposium, and I'm so glad to be here.
Welcome.
Thank you. So this is all new to me, and I'm totally fascinated with your talk. But just like a brush stroke, because it's, I can gather that too much is quite harmful, and at any moment in the day, it can be a different amount that you need, this vitamin D process. Wouldn't it just be best to say, sit in the sun every day for 15 minutes and your body will take what it needs and discard the rest because your body is an amazing machine? Versus these supplements and all of these, is that kind of a brush stroke thought?
So the question is, if anyone didn't hear it, why don't we simplify this and just get some sunshine? So actually, that sounds kind of like what I do. I don't really micromanage a lot of things unless I have specific rationales to do so. And I've had my 25-OHD levels measured here and there. I've had a lot of my genetics measured, and I haven't concluded that's a major thing that I need to be concerned with. But and so it's not one of the things that I'm micromanaging. And so I think, in general, it's better not to micromanage things if you're in optimal health when you don't micromanage things. But nevertheless, regardless of how wise that is, it's a fact that that the average person their physician is measuring their 25-OHD, this has massively increased over the last decade, and it's now becoming routine for physicians to measure 25-OHD in patients. And it's becoming routine as laboratories have unilaterally decided to raise the reference range from 12 to 30 or 32 and have not decided to follow the government's recommendation or the Institute of Medicine's recommendation to drop it to 20, that as that has been done and as measurement has increased, there has been an incredible surge in the number of people who are told you're deficient in vitamin D, you should take vitamin D supplements. So I designed this talk for this conference on the idea that I believe that a large proportion of people who are present here would be healthcare practitioners, and it seemed like a very, so interpreting blood measurements seemed like a very useful thing for that audience, and I think it's also useful for people who are on the other side of that, who are either intentionally getting their 25-OHD measured, which is extremely common in alternative health circles, or they're being told to have it measured and are told the same things. So what I'm saying is not meant to tell people that they shouldn't be just relaxing and getting sun. It's meant to give a more nuanced approach to people who are measuring 25-OHD.
But as a protocol to actually have that instead of taking that supplement, to get yourself in the sun every day.
Well, sunshine has a lot of benefits
much skin as possible.
Sunshine has a lot of benefits that vitamin D supplements don't have. I don't think vitamin D is an adequate substitute for sunshine. I agree with that, but there are probably cases in which someone's doing everything right, and yet they nevertheless do show signs of deficiency. And so I think it's important to understand how to interpret whether that does show the signs of deficiency. So I think you're right, and there's room for both sides.
From everything you said, that, oh my God, you can take too much, and that moment, it can be too much, and everything goes.
Okay, thank you. On this side?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Master-John. That was a very interesting talk. The main focus obviously was on the optimization of the numbers with regards to bone health. I'm very, very interested in vitamin D, and I think there's been a lot of change in the information that's out there, especially within the integrative medicine field. We were very aggressive about trying to optimize or push the levels up, super, super high, and that's changing a little bit. But I wonder a lot about the levels of the 25-hydroxy versus the calcitriol, and when the calcitriol is elevated on its own, whether that could reflect endogenous inflammation, macrophage activation, And if you could comment on that and the risks there as well.
Yeah, so there are, I was going to mention that, and I didn't for the sake of streamlining the physiology part, because that was taking a while. Okay, so I should, before we end, it would be very good for me to acknowledge that there are a lot of other things besides genetics and calcium that could potentially influence the conversion of 25-OHD to 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. And some of those things are good, and some of those things are bad. So one of those things is acute inflammation increases that conversion. I think it's probably the case that chronic inflammation also increases that rate of conversion. I think that's a little less well demonstrated, but it's pretty clearly demonstrated that acute inflammation does, and that principle probably transfers. But it's also the case that cancer cells, or at least many types of cancer cells, have an increased rate of that conversion, and that could sap the 25-OHD level. There are other things such as genetics, but also other nutrients that can enhance that conversion. So I think there's evidence that vitamin A will enhance the rate at which 25-OHD is taken up into the kidney, and thereby enhance the conversion of calcidiol to calcitriol. And I think that probably represents a good thing, because vitamin A has some cooperative functions with vitamin D, and I think it probably reflects the fact that the more you get of one vitamin, the more you needed the other, because they're doing cooperative functions. So I think there are good things that can change that, and there are bad things that can change that, but as a general principle, PTH is one of the key things that you would want to look at. Inflammatory markers could be another thing that you would want to look at. I think cancer would be the rare explanation for low 25-OHD, but if other things make that plausible, you would certainly want to investigate that, and if that were present, that could potentially explain that. But yeah, it's important to consider all those different things.
Thanks.
Yep. This side?
Thank you. Hi, my name is Buka Alone. I'm a nutrition consultant here in San Francisco. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'll admit a lot of what you said was, lots going on, but I have a patient or a client in particular with a removed parathyroid gland, and I'm curious if you can comment on the implications that might have on the uptake process, and downstream, this client has some metabolic syndrome issues, and if you think there might be some connections that I can make.
I would be the last person to ask insights on managing someone who doesn't have parathyroid glands. All I can say is that I would presume that if someone is missing the parathyroid gland, then that's going to compromise how precisely this system can be controlled. But I don't have the knowledge necessary to say anything practical about what that person should do differently because of that.
A quick follow-up, any tests in particular that you appreciate that measure calcitriol more accurately than others?
That's a good question. I mean, probably the most common one is going to be an immunoassay, and I think that that's a really difficult question, because most of the data for 25-OHD and calcitriol, if I'm not mistaken, is coming from immunoassays, and there are slowly chromatographic methods that are probably more accurate are beginning to displace those, but it's still the fact that all the reference ranges and all the observational studies are defined based on the most common immunoassays. So I actually think that the movement towards more accurate methods is going to have some collateral damage, which is that, for example, when I showed you, so this data from the Messiah on the left is probably more accurate than what I put on the right, but it really distorts your point of view, because the reference ranges and all the other data that I showed you are using the immunoassays. I haven't looked into it as much with calcitriol. That's probably the case also with calcitriol, but I feel like until all these things are sorted out, it's not so much about the accuracy as it is about the concordance between your results and all the other data. And in that case, the most common assays are going to be the most useful at the time being.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
on this side.
Hey, my name's Evan. Great talk.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the body's ability to store calcitriol and calcidiol, especially as it relates to the seasonality of sun exposure?
Sure. So there's the main storage of calcidiol and calcitriol is in the general circulation. There is storage of vitamin D, and I think if 25-OHD reaches levels high enough, there's going to be spillover into adipose tissue, for example. But I think the bulk of adipose storage is going to be vitamin D, and if I don't think there's going to be much stored calcitriol, maybe a little bit, but I think if your 25-OHD levels reach a certain point, then they will spill over into adipose tissue. But I think for the average person who isn't supplementing, most of that's, in general, I think that storage is probably going to be vitamin D just because of its, because fluctuatingly, when you're exposed to it, that's what's circulating the highest concentrations. And during that time period, there's going to be spillover into adipose tissue. But I think from a practical perspective, I think, depending on where you're living, if you look at the Arctic environment where there's a pretty narrow window of vitamin D synthesis, one of the key factors in their ability to make it through the year was to have cultural traditions around food that store calcium and vitamin D in the form of dried fish and dried fish bones. I think when you're in areas of the world, probably ours, where there's a much wider range, a much wider window of vitamin D synthesis, there's probably a meaningful contribution to storage and release of stored vitamin D. But I feel like I favor not micromanaging it so much. So in my particular case where I don't believe that I have vitamin D related health issues that I need to worry about, I do tend to focus more on eating more vitamin D rich foods and maybe supplementing in the winter and maybe supplementing with a little vitamin D in the coldest periods of the year. But I do assume that my generous sun exposure during the warmer parts of the year is also augmenting my vitamin D status during that time.
Okay, thanks.
That's the best I can offer you for detail. And it's 4 o'clock. Okay, thank you everyone.